World War II showed one of the worst facets of humanity. The brutality experienced in those years left scars that are still not completely healed and that are still being studied. One of the most abhorrent and silenced crimes of that conflict is the systematic abuse suffered by German women at the hands of Soviet, American and British soldiers. In this new military history video, we want to shed light on these terrible facts. To begin, we want to warn you that in this video we'll be talking about really brutal crimes, with numbers that can be shocking. While those kinds of situations are part of the horror of war, we prefer to warn you about the harshness of these stories. Even so, we assure you that they will be counted with the respect they deserve. During the last year of World War II, as the Allies closed in on the heart of the Third Reich, hundreds of thousands of German women were abused. Subsequent studies indicated that the vast majority of these crimes were committed by Soviet troops, although there are records of American, British, and French soldiers taking part in such acts. In general, these cases were silenced and remained an open secret for almost the entire 20th century. According to historian Antony Beevor, whose books were banned in 2015 at some Russian schools and universities, the NKVD, the Soviet Union's secret police, was aware of these events but did little to prevent the soldiers' behavior. Usually it was the rear units that committed the most crimes against German women. These actions were taken as a patriotic act and encouraged by propaganda. The Soviet writer Ilya Ehrenberg wrote to the soldiers, "Use force and break the racial pride of German women, take them as your fair spoils of war." The exact number of German women who suffered abuse at the hands of Soviet soldiers is unknown, but some sources estimate the number to be in the hundreds of thousands. Other more pessimistic figures bring the number closer to 2 million. During World War II, the first records of such crimes within German territory date back to October 21, 1944, when Red Army troops crossed the Angrapa River on the border between Germany and Poland. That same day the Soviets carried out the Nemmersdorf massacre, in which 71 people died, among them many women who, before being shot, suffered all kinds of harassment. One of the most aberrational facts was offered by the historian William Hitchcock. According to his research, in many cases the women suffered more than one attack. In the most severe cases, they could be victims of up to 70 abuses in a very short period of time, causing unwanted pregnancies and epidemics of sexually transmitted diseases. Some 100,000 women are believed to have been abused in Berlin, raising the need for medical care in hospital reports in the German city. In short, it was a health catastrophe, with some 10,000 deaths registered as a result of medical intervention related to sexual abuse. It is estimated that, in total, 240,000 women died as a consequence of this. Not all the sources of the Second World War are historians who see the past through the eyes of the present. The testimonies of the people who lived through that terrible moment are also of great value. One good example of this is the diary of the young Ukrainian Lieutenant Vladimir Gelfand, who was among the Soviet troops surrounding the German capital in 1945. One of the most shocking passages was written on April 25. The lieutenant was walking along the Spree River when he ran into a group of German women carrying suitcases and old clothes. In poor German, he asked them why they were running away from their homes. The women tearfully told him that at least 20 Russian soldiers had attacked them the night before and had taken turns abusing them. But sexual violence was not a monopoly of the Red Army. American soldiers were guilty of similar terrible crimes, although on a smaller scale. Author J. Robert Lilly claims that there were 11,040 cases of attacks by U.S. soldiers. The most brutal occurred during the U.S. occupation of France after the Normandy landings. Many of the American harassments on German women were mob and at gunpoint, adding a sadistic spice to their crime. From the high command of the United States Army, laws were established against fraternization between its soldiers and German women, but within the force the phrase copulation without conversation is not fraternization became popular, an ironic way of referring to this kind of violence. Osmar White was an Australian correspondent who accompanied American troops during the war. In his texts, he describes how each case was treated depending on the unit. In some cases, the aggressor was identified, tried by court-martial, and punished. The most brutal and sadistic cases received the maximum penalty of firing squad. The problem is that most of the trials were against African American soldiers. I know very well that many of the attacks were carried out by white soldiers. In those cases, there were no major consequences. Among countries with soldiers found guilty of such crimes, the UK seems to have been the most active in conducting military trials. The British military police investigated the cases, and if serious, they proceeded to a court-martial. The only problem is that drunkenness and post-traumatic stress disorder were seen as viable excuses to reduce the culprit's sentence, so many British attackers received minimal reprimands. An especially aberrational case is that of the French soldiers, who committed crimes quite similar to those of the Red Army. There are official documents that record the number of attacks in different German towns. The figures range from 300 to 600 cases per region, but the chilling fact is that a few thousand women lived in those places, so a huge percentage of the female population was the victim of these attacks. As within the United States Army, the blame was mainly placed on soldiers of Moroccan origin or one of the French colonies. According to historical studies, it is estimated that a total of 1,500 children were born as a result of the French soldiers abusing the women. Although the son of a soldier was considered a citizen of France, in general the parents did not take charge and the children became part of the smoking ruins of the German cities. One of the main obstacles to studying these crimes is that for years they were silenced and the testimonies dismissed, as they came from German women who were supposed to be former members of the Nazi Party. There was a notion that since the Third Reich had committed some of the most heinous crimes in history, any kind of revenge on its people was valid. In post-war Germany, especially in West Germany, the stories of these crimes gradually became a central point in the historical debate, generating the most varied opinions.
During World War II, prostitution experienced significant growth, either through the establishment of infamous militarized brothels or the creation of establishments even within concentration camps. However, the Soviet Union took a contrary stance, adopting an increasingly harsh position to combat what they considered a degeneration inherent in capitalism. From the mass closure of establishments to the persecution and execution of sex workers, Soviet methods were brutal. The issue was that the Axis forces were avid consumers of such services, creating a hostile atmosphere in the conquered Soviet territories. In this new video on military history, we want to take you on a temporal journey to understand why prostitution was taboo in Russian lands, and how the oldest profession in history continued to survive illegally under Stalin's government. In Moscow, prostitution was permitted for almost 75 years, between 1843 and the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. In the ancient city, the heart of the Tsarist Empire, there were all kinds of sexual services. First-rate brothels offered group sessions for an hour, for a total of 15 rubles. For the more demanding, at the price of 7 rubles per person, one could access the popular carnal game known as Nanny, Hurt Me More. We won't delve into details, but considering the name, you can surely draw your own conclusions. These services were intended for the powerful and wealthy, while the common people frequented second-rate brothels, where a few rubles were paid for a private encounter of half an hour. Finally, for the most desperate, there were third-level establishments where, for 50 kopecks, equivalent to 1/100th of a ruble, one could hire the services of a lady. For a more everyday reference, this was equivalent to the cost of a dozen eggs. Considering this well-established sexual economy, one wonders how an ancient empire came to allow such consumption. In Imperial Russia, prostitution became legal through a decree issued by Nicholas I in 1843. This wasn't due to widespread promiscuity, but rather a method of sanitary containment. In many ways, it was a reaction by authorities to massive outbreaks of diseases, such as syphilis and other genital infections. Posters from the time depict widespread panic about diseases that, for many, were a result of casual sex. The last one reads the phrase casual sex, the main source of venereal diseases. In response to this crisis, doctors called for measures to reduce the number of cases, and the only viable way was to have control over brothels, inspecting the sanitary conditions of the place and the women working there. This document is one of those handed to sex workers, with their physical condition and corresponding signatures. This mechanism closely resembles that employed by the Third Reich in Europe during its massive expansion in World War II. Fearing sexually transmitted diseases that decimated their ranks and possible homosexual relationships among soldiers, Germany initiated a network of militarized brothels. One of the most famous was Salon Kitty, located in Berlin, which served as both a brothel and a spy center. At the top of this establishment, girls seduced important men who, in moments of weakness or pleasure, revealed secrets of great importance to the Reich. The entire place was wired, and through cables, information reached a recording room below. Of course, not all places were as sophisticated. Typically, establishments operated in old houses that, in many cases, had been brothels before the Nazi occupation. However, in these rooms, German girls did not sleep. Instead, young slaves from ravaged communities, mainly Polish, were forced into violent encounters with soldiers. Roma and Jewish women were not eligible for this work, so they were sent to forced labor camps. Later, we will see in detail how this sexual policy functioned during the German campaign in Soviet territory. Now let's return to the Eurasian giant. Russia is a vast country both horizontally and vertically, to the extent that this expanse has been one of the main challenges to overcome for those in power. The first medical and police committee was established on Kolbovsky Street, and officials posed a question: why traverse the entire city when interested parties could be asked to come to the organization? Thus, the first permits granted to brothels stipulated their installation a few meters from the committee's building, in the infamous Sretenka district. According to preserved data from 1874, out of 152 households, 97 were brothels. These were the faces and bodies that the clientele found there. Earlier, we detailed the 3 types of services that a Russian citizen could access, and incredible as it may sound, these 3 levels were devised by none other than Tsar Nicholas Thurser. Realizing that a high-ranking official would not want to sleep in a bed where a mere soldier had just slept, he divided brothels into 3 categories. The first can be compared to a VIP lounge, a private club accessible only to wealthy personalities. Young women from Germany, Poland, and the current Baltic countries were recruited for the services provided there, forming a kind of Tower of Babel in the heart of Moscow. The prostitutes spoke several European languages, played music, and could engage in any conversation. Regarding sexual health, a few salons offered condoms, but these were neither cheap nor hygienic as, before the invention of latex, they were made from animal intestines or tissues. These condoms were not easy to use and did not provide protection against sexually transmitted diseases, so they were not popular among men. In first-class institutions, there were mainly young women from the city, and in third-category institutions, there were mainly girls from the humblest villages. What they all had in common was that the harsh life of a prostitute significantly affected their health. Medical checkups were barely a bureaucratic matter aimed at ensuring they did not have syphilis and similar diseases. No one cared if they were malnourished or dying from chronic alcoholism. To endure the work, Russian prostitutes drank 4 glasses of vodka in the morning on an empty stomach. During the day, the dose increased, aiming to stay drunk and confused to pay little attention to their harsh reality. All these hardships continued until 1917, when the most radical revolution in history erupted in the heart of Russia. The Bolshevik Revolution completely abolished this system, arguing that phenomena like prostitution and drug consumption were worrying symptoms of capitalist decadence. However, under Soviet noses, sex work continued to exist, albeit illegally. The most important policy to eradicate the phenomenon was the establishment of treatment centers, where women were provided with medical assistance and vocational education so they could embark on a new career in one of the many cooperatives that emerged after the 1917 revolution. This led to a significant reduction, almost to the point of extinction, of prostitution in the regions where these centers operated. However, once again, the size and extent of Russia were a problem, as this policy affected only about half of the women engaged in prostitution. In 1919, a forced labor camp for women was established in Petrograd. There, around 6,500 prisoners endured the hardships of Soviet prison life, with 60% accused of prostitution, by then a crime punishable by imprisonment. Simultaneously, efforts continued to rehabilitate some prostitutes considered victims of the capitalist system, leading to the establishment of the Commission to Combat Prostitution in 1919, an agency under the People's Commissariat of Health. In 1929, a system was introduced where prostitutes were sent to special forced labor institutions for re-education. In case of relapse after a stay in these camps, they were sent to more brutal detention centers intended for criminals and enemies of the state. In the early years of the 1930s, suspicious foreign women engaging in prostitution were deported to their home countries, although over time all captured women were imprisoned in facilities with varying levels of police control. The next significant step in this persecution process occurred with the onset of World War II. As part of their military advance strategy, Axis countries often established militarized brothels. We've already explained the German situation, but the Italians were also part of this sexual domination process. The images you just saw correspond to the Italian advance on Russian territory. During the Italian campaign in the Soviet Union, Mussolini's soldiers formed relationships with Russian women, despite constant instructions from authorities to avoid any contact with the local population for security and hygiene reasons. Some Axis soldiers even engaged in cohabitation, forming romantic relationships with Soviet women. To prevent these problematic situations, Italian authorities also favored the installation of brothels, regulated in a military manner, allowing for health control but also avoiding excessive contact between troops and local women. Beyond believing that a soldier in love might be more prone to cowardice, there was also a fear of espionage. In many cases, the concern was that these women, who won over Axis men, might be seeking information or moments of weakness to collaborate with the Red Army. Historians have had difficulty reconstructing the activities of the Italian army in Soviet territory, since much of the material preserved from that time perpetuates the image of the good Italian, the respectful and romantic invader who treats his conquered well. In many cases, the love stories recounted by Italian troops returning to their homeland were actually tales of encounters with prostitutes or abused young women. The Germans had a similar experience to the Italians. Although the establishment of militarized brothels, one of the trademarks of Nazism, proved to be a challenging task. On the one hand, the hatred of Soviet peasants towards the Germans was too great to fraternize, and on the other hand, there were not many pre-existing brothels in operation. Remember that the Reich took advantage of already open establishments and experienced prostitutes, but in Russian territory, this was not possible due to the government's prohibition of the activity. Unfortunately, unable to channel their sexual frustrations in exchange for money, German soldiers carried out brutal crimes against women in conquered areas. This was a brutal contrast compared to the French case, where, before the German invasion, a large number of brothels were operating and were later taken over by military services. That's why it is often said that, in French territory, sex work experienced a golden age during World War II. Similarly, relationships between French women and Axis soldiers were much more common. In the Soviet case, romances with German soldiers were much rarer, although, after the war ended, these women were persecuted and humiliated with the same brutality across Europe. What you're seeing on the screen is not a witch hunt, but the punishments received by French prostitutes who had relationships with Germans during the occupation. In Russia, such images were not seen, but there was contempt for traitorous sex workers. And in many cases, it ended with women imprisoned in forced labor camps. Some Russian girls voluntarily married officers, officials, and soldiers of the Wehrmacht, either out of love, convenience, or a strange Stockholm syndrome. That's why in 1942 a circular from the NKVD of the Soviet Union appeared, recognizing women who had sexual relations with the Nazis as prostitutes and traitors, crimes punishable by death or perpetual stay in one of the Siberian gulags. NKVD department heads had to start their work in liberated territories by arresting protectors and collaborators of the Germans, including brothel owners. Many girlfriends of Germans were punished both socially and politically, being sent to detention centers or expelled from their communities in shame. However, not all Russian women went with the Germans willingly. Some of them followed orders from the Soviet command and collected intelligence with notable success. The suspicions of Axis officers about the danger of espionage were partly true. When World War II concluded, prostitutes once again became a shame for the socialist ideal. The topic was considered taboo for the Soviet Union, which is why newspapers and intellectuals of the time did not write about it. Such was the ideological denial that it was not until 1980 that the term was included in the Soviet Encyclopedic Dictionary, defining prostitution as an evil that arose in anti-socialist societies and spread due to capitalism. Nevertheless, ideological denials did not prevent the existence of prostitution in the Soviet Union, especially in the more marginalized regions where urban progress did not reach with the same intensity. The black market for sex work flourished in various forms, such as vacation resorts where, with room rentals and room service, the company of beautiful ladies was included. The growth of these types of businesses increased during the 1970s, when some economic crises resulted in the impoverishment of a large part of the female population, forcing them to resort to extreme methods of survival. As you can see, prostitution is a global phenomenon with various facets, whether in refined brothels for the bourgeoisie or in militarized establishments where young women are little more than animals. The sex trade has constantly changed, adapting to the historical context. The same happened in the Soviet Union, from the total acceptance of prostitutes to their persecution as criminals. who reported the crime, but the chain of command, including his commander, took no action. The young man had to endure threats against his life from his former colleagues who participated in the murder, but he continued his crusade so that Phan Thi Mao's death would not go unpunished. His persistence was eventually successful and led to a court-martial against the 4 soldiers responsible. During this process, the victim and his family were identified, and testimonies were obtained from the mother and sister. Privates Thomas Cipriano Garcia and Jose Garcia were convicted of and murder, while Sergeant Gervais was found guilty only of the murder charge. The Hill 192 incident remains one of the bloodiest and darkest chapters of the American intervention in Vietnam. Before moving on to the next case, we want to know your opinion on the matter. Do you think Private Storby acted well, or should he have done more to prevent Phan Thi Mao's death? Leave us your answer in the comments box. According to researcher Gina Marie Weaver, author of the book Ideologies of Forgetting in the Vietnam War, the role of statutory in the conflict was left aside by the narratives of both sides. Neither the United States is willing to accept that its troops committed horrible crimes, nor is Vietnam willing to make peace with its society, which in many cases marginalizes the victims. Weaver postulates that Americans have an inability to reconcile rape and sexual assault with the figure of wounded and psychologically damaged veterans. Both concepts cannot coexist in the North American imagination. Heroes or villains, never a middle ground. Photojournalism and cinema played an important role in problematizing North American actions in Southeast Asia. Films such as Apocalypse Now, Platoon, or Sins of War shed light on the most unpleasant part of the conflict, including the darkest activities of Uncle Sam's troops. But no record of that time is as iconic as this photo. You've surely seen it hundreds of times, but do you really know who the young protagonist of the dramatic capture is? Her name is Kim Phuc Phan Thi, and in 1972 she was just 9 years old when photographer Nick Ut immortalized her. She ran naked and screamed in pain as her body was being burned by remains of the napalm dropped by the United States. Fortunately, Kim was able to survive and became a tireless fighter for peace and the vindication of the Vietnamese people. The following interview was given in 2022.
So thankful that I have been learned so much about the lessons of life in my life. And so now I'm thinking about 50 years ago, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now I am in the right time and the right place.
Let's take up sexual assaults again. The big problem when it comes to accounting for these attacks is that the records were either ignored or directly destroyed. Complaints were generally never reported to the war court and were resolved internally, with a minor reprimand for the perpetrator of the atrocities. Worse still, at times, sexual violence was encouraged under the idea that the Vietnamese people should be tamed by force, dominating a naturally rebellious population with an iron fist. The outrages against peasant women were seen as trophies for the soldiers' hard work, a well-deserved loot after long hours of combat. Of course, this stance is dehumanizing and led to events like those on Hill 192. Some American veterans believe that violence against Vietnamese women was also motivated by growing racism within the troops, particularly against Asian peoples. The culture shock was shocking, and many young people saw these people as inferior beings without a modern and advanced culture. By not considering them peers, any atrocity committed had less weight and did not carry any type of remorse. At the same time, the establishment of brothels and the growth of prostitution in the region gave an impression of sexual debauchery. For many Marines, Vietnam was a gigantic brothel in which they could let their darkest instincts run wild. After all, they were far from home and any authority that could punish them for their crimes. This veteran's words are brief but revealing.
How did the guys look when they were doing this?
They looked like they were having a lot of good time.
Did you see anyone not?
No, I think everybody was just about everybody was busy.
According to military sources, only 41 cases of rape committed by United States military personnel resulted in court-martial. The majority occurred between 1965 and 1973. Yes, you heard right. Only 41 judicial proceedings after more than a decade of constant war in which hundreds of thousands of people died. It goes without saying that these figures are ridiculous. It is known that there were thousands of victims of outrages, but time and war were responsible for burying their stories. Not all the women had the fortitude of Tran Thi Ngai to tell her experiences in detail. We only have to wait for justice and for the corresponding governments to accept the blame and give the corresponding recognition to Vietnamese women. In this way, we reach the end of the video. If you are interested in this type of content on hard topics related to the world of war and its past, we recommend you subscribe and activate notifications. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.